Right, now, good afternoon, Mr Dunlop.
Afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Ms Hedge.
Yes, we have one witness this afternoon, it's Ms Hedge. And for the benefit of your lordship and the transcript, the organisational statement provided by Ms Hedge is referenced SCI WT 0159, then the usual 5 zeros and a 1.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms Hedge.
Good afternoon.
I wonder if you could provide us with your full name.
It's Karen Louise Hedge.
Thank you. And you've provided us with a statement, that's correct, isn't it?
That's correct.
Before I move on to any of the substantive questions, is there anything within the statement that you would like to correct?
Yes, there is. I note, unfortunately, after submission, that the organisation, or the title of the organisation at which I previously worked at, is wrong. It should be the Prince of Wales Foundation, not the Prince's Trust. And
I think we find that, do we find that in paragraph 2 in the last 3 lines? I think the statement should be before you.
Yes.
We see a sentence, whilst based in Washington, DC, I was the Director of Finance, Governance and Compliance at the Prince's Trust. And we should we score out Trust and put in Foundation, is that?
Prince of Wales Foundation.
Prince of Wales Foundation. And having read through the statement, is that the only error that you've identified?
Absolutely. I was forensic about the stuff pertaining to the pandemic and missed my own background.
Not at all, not at all. These things happen. We've heard evidence this morning from your colleague, Dr McCaskill, in relation to, I didn't hear the evidence, but I understand it was in relation to care homes. Am I correct that your evidence today before the inquiry considers care at home services and what you refer to in your statement as housing support services? Is that correct?
That's correct, and some daycare services as well, who are also our members.
Thank you. And just for our benefit, when we talk about care at home, it might seem self-explanatory, but housing support services may not. Could you just explain briefly what you mean by those terms?
Absolutely, and actually it's difficult to describe because there's a myriad of different ways that it could present, but effectively it's where you have housing with additional support. So someone would come in to where somebody lives in their own home to provide them support. It could be personal care, it could be less than that. It just depends on what individuals need at that point in time.
Is there any minimum or maximum number of hours or services, or can it just vary from person to person?
It varies from person to person, yes.
Okay. I wonder if we can look forward to paragraphs 9 and 11 of your statement, and at that point you're talking about it's under the chapter Scottish Care's engagement with members during the pandemic, and you highlight that there were regular meetings every fortnight for members who were delivering care at home. You also state that there were concerns about the guidance and changes in the operating arrangements, such as banning agency staff working in care homes. Was that the particular concerns about the guidance, or was there other concerns about the guidance that members were expressing?
Many and several. The biggest challenge with the guidance was the rate and the speed at which it was changing. So the ability for providers to keep on top of that was difficult. We heard some of that in Dr McCaskill's statement this morning about the impact that had on the staff then trying to enact that, and that was no different for care at home organisations as it was for care homes. And
were members expressing that to you directly, and what did Scottish Care do in relation to that when it became aware of there was an issue with the speed at which it was changing?
So one of the things that we do very well as a membership organisation is engaging with our members to find out, how are they experiencing things on the ground, trying to get as much evidence as we can behind that to present that to the organisations that were making the decisions. Principally that would have been Scottish Government or RHI, but also organisations such as the Care Inspectorate and local health and social care partnerships.
Sorry, immediately after Scottish Government, you said a word which didn't immediately spring to my knowledge.
Yeah, it's part of public health.
And what did you describe it as?
RHI, A-R-H-A-I, and please don't ask me to tell you what they stand for.
Yeah. I won't then.
But it's where the infection prevention control guidance came from.
Okay, thank you. And you said there that the speed at which guidance was changing was a concern to members. What about the interpretation of the guidance? Was that an issue, or was it clear it was just the issue of speed that was a problem?
So because the guidance was wide-ranging, sometimes it was clear, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was interpreted differently locally than it was nationally, and sometimes it was interpreted differently between different organisations. And I don't mean our members when I'm referencing that, I mean between, for instance, the Care Inspectorate and individuals in public health. And that caused challenge for our members on the ground, knowing, what was expected from them in that instance.
And if it wasn't clear and that, as you say, caused a challenge, was Scottish Care doing anything to address that? Were the members, what was being done?
So the surgeries that we set up were particularly useful in that instance because it gave us a very quick ability to respond to what was happening in real time and then feed that into government meetings. So we specifically timed the surgeries to be earlier in the week so that when we went to the government meetings, which were usually on a Wednesday and a Thursday, then we were doing that in a timely manner. We also have a branch structure which comprises of volunteer members and it roughly matches Health and Social Care Partnerships area, but there are some which duplicate just for ease. And we have some staff who are funded by Health and Social Care Partnerships, but hosted by Scottish Care and employed by Scottish Care, who are also really integral in raising issues and concerns in the local areas as well, and enabling sort of constructive collaboration where possible.
And just to go back and touch on it, you mentioned that there were surgeries which were held before the meetings, which were normally on a Wednesday and Thursday. Can I take it from that then that there was weekly surgeries?
Yeah, so actually in the very early days there were twice weekly, and then when things became more stable we reduced the number.
And can you tell us, when you say surgeries, what did that involve? Were they held remotely? Who was invited? Can you tell us a little bit more about what?
Yeah, so the surgeries specifically were a Q&A session, so members could come and talk about their experiences, and they could ask questions and ask to seek clarification on things like the interpretation of the guidance, and equally ask us to raise issues into, for instance, Scottish Government. Alongside that, we also hosted webinars, and the webinars were where we invited other experts to come and speak to our members as well. It was mostly, we would close the surgeries to our members only, though, to give them a safe space where they could also experience some peer support.
And who was providing the answers at these surgeries? Was that yourself or?
And Dr. McCaskill, yes. And occasionally we would have, other members of the team who might have specific expertise. And
were they well attended?
Extremely well attended. We had to increase our licensing to enable more people to attend. And I think Dr. McCaskill this morning referenced at one meeting there were 240 of our members present. To clarify, we have about 350 members.
In terms of, you mentioned other bodies just earlier in your evidence. If your members had any concerns about either guidance or issues with other bodies, did you have a mechanism of contacting those other bodies? I mean, you've talked about the Wednesday and Thursday meetings. Were those other bodies at those meetings?
Yes, in the main, yes, they were. Though there was some distance in the early days with public health, which would have been Health Protection Scotland at that point in time. Other challenges that we had actually was the method for getting in contact with the individuals responsible for different portfolios changed throughout the pandemic. So not only was the guidance changing, not only were the meetings that we went to changing, but actually the persons responsible was changing frequently as well. So sometimes it was a case of just finally finding the person with responsibility for it and holding on to their email address for dear life. And other times, you were redirected through a central mailbox system, which was then siphoned off. So that made it particularly difficult when you consider the pace at which things were changing, actually finding ways to navigate the system and to get into the system and to find the relevant person to speak to was difficult also.
But you've talked to us, obviously, there's a line of communication and you're feeding back and you're at these meetings with the Scottish Government. Were they listening to the members' concerns and acting upon them, or not?
Again, I'm going to give you a varied response. So there were experiences which were extremely supportive and extremely helpful. So examples I'll give there would be around about PPE, which in the early days was difficult, but then very quickly through NSS, Scottish governments, stepped up to support the sector through the creation of hubs and access to the right quality and standard of PPE. And there were other areas where it felt as though our presence was tokenistic and that rarely were changes made to the guidance when we were raising the issues and the concerns of providers. And in relation to, more examples in this space for care homes than I have for care at home, but one of the big issues I would raise there would be about the oversight arrangements that existed at the time.
Okay, and by oversight arrangements, is that care inspector are you talking about, or what do you
No,
mean
it's
by?
not. So during the pandemic, oversight arrangements were stepped up where they had individuals from public health who were reported to the local director of nursing who would go into care homes and effectively undertake which was a sort of inspection, looking at infection prevention control, but also straying beyond that into areas which the care inspectorate were responsible for. That caused huge confusion in the front line and did not recognise the pre-existing skill set of staff in the sector.
I won't go into care homes too much with you. I appreciate that Dr. McCaskill's evidence has been part heard and will be continued at some point later in this
There
month.
is, maybe be helpful to talk about another piece of guidance where we did manage to get change. So initially there were recommendations made for staff not to car share, but we managed to give feedback from the sector to relevant persons at governments to make change there, though it did take a couple of weeks. The reasons that would not have been appropriate for this sector is because actually many people who work in care at home don't have a car. It is, although a highly skilled role, it is a lowly paid role. So we had to recognise that many of them don't have a car, many of them work part-time. So car sharing was a significant part of how they would undertake their job. The alternative to not sharing a car would be to travel on a bus, which would potentially put them at greater risk because they would be travelling with more people in an enclosed space as opposed to their known colleagues, which is who they'd be travelling with in a car. So the same people that would be going into people's homes with.
And am I correct in assuming that a lot of people who need care at home require two carers in it at one time?
Yeah, that can be the case, particularly, if people need support to use a hoist, maybe for showering purposes, things like that, yeah.
In your statement at paragraph 18, under the chapter, the key issues and impacts, care at home, you say in paragraph 18 that the way care could be provided to individuals at home was severely affected by the pandemic. I just wonder if you can give me some examples of how it was affected.
So actually we know that there were significant staff shortages at the time, and we know that some people had their care packages limited by local authorities to respond to some of that. We also know that some people chose to reduce the care packages they had to be able to ease the impact on the social care workforce. Even a colleague of ours was written to by the local authority asking if they would reduce the care and support for their mother at that time. We also know there was significant backlog in social work assessments being undertaken, which then resulted in significant delays to people in the community getting the care and support that they would otherwise have been able to access far more quickly.
Okay. Can I maybe just pick you up on a couple of those points? You said there were staff shortages. I wonder what the reason for those staff shortages were.
Yeah, we were in a pandemic. Many staff also experienced, catching COVID and had to take time off for that. There were also instances where some COVID tests, would have given a false positive reading as well.
And were some of those carers shielding?
Some of the social care workforce, the
Yes,
paid carers.
Yes.
So I just wanted to distinguish.
Yes, of course.
So yes, some paid carers would be shielding. In those instances, it would be the first step would be to see if they could find some other work within the organisation. Maybe they could work remotely from home, doing rostering or, support to frontline carers over the phone. But actually, if you needed to shield, then you may have to take time out of work.
And you also said that care was, the local authorities sought to limit care, and you gave an example of one person, and please don't name any names,
No.
but one person being asked to reduce the care services that they were receiving. Why were local authorities doing that if there were people that were prepared to go out and provide that care?
So just to clarify, it wasn't just one person. So we have letters from quite a few partnerships or local authorities who wrote blanket to everyone that was accessing care and support in that particular local authority area. So it was, a fairly common practice in some areas at that point in time. And the reason was, to reduce the burden upon the local authority. That's what they wrote in the letter. But we also know that that had a significant impact on some individuals who reduced their care with the intent of helping the system, but putting the system before themselves as a human being and their needs.
And maybe they will ask if these letters can be produced, but in terms of reducing the burden, was that a financial burden? Was it the burden of assessing what care was required? Do you know what was meant by burden?
So I don't have, that would need to be a question to those who made that, but I do know that conversations that were had with local authority areas at that point in time described the delays to social work assessments, and they described workforce shortages. So it may have been a combination of those things. There may well be other things as well contributing to that decision. Thank
you. Moving on to paragraph 20, you discuss guidance, and we've had a chat about guidance already. I just wonder if you can tell me, in terms of the guidance, was the guidance sufficient in terms of advising your members what should be worn in terms of PPE? So I think, first of all, it's important to note that it took a very long time to get guidance for care at home in comparison to other parts of the health and social care system. So that in itself was a worry and a concern. And then when it did come, there was confusion or the requirement of a lesser amount of PPE to be worn than in other parts of the system. So what we saw was, people living in their own homes in the communities and care-at-home workers not having to wear PPE unless they thought that individual had COVID. So they were walking into a home. One person gave an example of walking into a home, at which point a community nurse was leaving that person's home, and the community nurse was wearing, full gown, mask, gloves, and yet the individual working in care at home, provisions to the social care worker, was not entitled to that same protection. And nor was that individual living in their own home. The assessment was done based upon where you worked, not upon who was coming into your home and who was at risk. There's a couple of points I wonder if I can ask you about. You said it took some time for guidance to come out. Am I correct that before lockdown, Scottish Care, and I think you deal with this in your statement, Scottish Care produced its own guidance due to a failure by the Scottish Government to provide guidance. Is that correct? That's correct, yes. And I think you deal with that in your statement at paragraph 14. Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to ask, is there a reason that you're aware of why the Scottish Government couldn't have provided guidance, firstly, just generally at an earlier stage, and why it took, well, I'll ask you the first question first, I'll ask you in two parts, why the Scottish Government couldn't have produced guidance at an earlier stage? I don't know the reasoning why Scottish Government did not provide anything sooner. However, having been involved with the EU exit preparation planning with the Scottish Government, I sat in a room and listened to a 20-minute presentation by an NHS consultant on what social care was. So I have a belief that there was a misunderstanding and misrecognition of what social care is and does and has the potential to do. So I think in that lack of understanding and recognition may well have caused the delays. And what led you to conclude that there was a lack of understanding? What, or can you give us some examples?
So the failure to understand, for instance, the description of that I gave earlier about who a frontline care worker is in care at home, the constraints that they face, also the remarkable skill set they already have existing in infection prevention control, because they're already managing things like norovirus, flu in the communities as well, and preventing that. So it came through for me in the way that the guidance was published and produced, and it was done particularly, and I will make particular reference here to care homes, but I think there was a particular failing in that space around about not recognising that it's an individual's home, that they bring their personal effects with them into a care home because it is their home, it's where they live. And for care at home, they didn't necessarily recognise that a care worker is going into someone's home over which they have no control over the environment. So the guidance didn't recognise, for instance, there could be other family members present in that home and what to do in that instance. Should they wear PPE? Should they not? It didn't make reference to what the environment could be. Was there windows? Were there ventilation? Things like that as well. So because these idiosyncrasies, this real detailed stuff was not there or not recognised, then that, for me, is that failure to understand.
Thank you. We saw that Scottish Care produced guidance before the lockdown in relation to, or for the benefit of your members. Can you remember, you said it took a long time for the Scottish Government to issue guidance which was specifically directed at care at home services. Do you remember when roughly that was produced?
It was right in front of me on the on the screen. I think it was the 26th of March. It was on the section that was up earlier. So I know that only feels like a few weeks after we published our guidance, but I think it was so long ago now we forget how scared we were at that point in time, what the uncertainties were. We didn't truly understand the nature of the virus. We didn't truly understand the spread, nor did we understand in that context what we could do to protect people and ourselves and our workforce. So although it was only a matter of weeks, it felt, like a matter of years out there. People worrying, am I going into this person's house? Will I infect them with the pandemic? How do I carry that with me for the rest of my career? So basically crying out for guidance and support.
In terms of, we know that the Scottish Government's relatively well-resourced. In terms of Scottish Care producing guidance, what resources did you have to produce that guidance? I don't know what size the organisation is, and my apologies if that came out this morning in evidence, but are there a lot of staff? Or?
We are a small charity. We have sort of circulate around about 40, but over half of our team work part-time. So as with many other organisations during the pandemic, it was very much an all hands on deck situation and scenario. So, many people in our team, as in many other organisations, went above and beyond.
Thank you. Now, in your evidence there, you gave an example of a community nurse coming out who was obviously more fully equipped with PPE than some of your members' staff. Particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, in late March and early April 2020, did your members have difficulties sourcing A, sufficient quantities, and B, suitable PPE to go into homes?
Absolutely, yes. Particularly smaller organisations found it difficult because they didn't necessarily have the same purchasing power as the larger organisations, or possibly even the storage capabilities that larger organisations might have had to just have that number of masks or gloves stored somewhere in any eventuality. Scottish Care at that point in time worked closely with suppliers, and a colleague was enlisted in contacting all the various suppliers and issuing every week, every Monday morning, in fact, a list of here's where you can get gloves, here's the prices, here's where you can get masks, here's the prices. So, you know, we did as much as we possibly could to access that. Another colleague supported a group of providers to come together so that they could bulk purchase together. But unfortunately, we still heard occurrences when, you know, shipments of PPE came into the UK that they were then didn't get to the provider who'd purchased them.
Why was that?
So we heard stories that they were being commandeered for the use of the NHS, though we have no evidence, but that's what we were told.
And in terms of the smaller organisations who were having difficulties, as you identified, securing PPE, in terms of the prices of PPE, I mean, I think it's probably within judicial knowledge that that had gone up. Did that have an impact on the ability of your members to purchase PPE?
Absolutely, and for all our members. So, you know, you could add a couple of zeros on the end of what things had previously cost.
You also discussed earlier that your member staff from your member organisations could be going into homes where the community nurse had come out fully kitted. Did that cause any concerns to your particular members that they didn't have the same level of kit, if you like, as others? And what type of concerns was it causing? Huge
concern. Because it was such a time of uncertainty, nobody knew, you know, what the impact of the pandemic was going to be at that point in time and how to mitigate that risk. So they were seeing people coming out looking as though they were very well protected, and they felt like they were second-class citizens. They felt like they were, you know, there was an acceptance that they could be put at risk, whereas members of, for instance, the NHS could not be put at risk. So they felt like there was a hierarchy in their relevance as persons and as individuals. And I'll give an example of a frontline worker who I spoke to at the time, who described coming in from their shift, calling to the members of their household not to come into the hall. They then stripped their clothing off, ran from their front door to their washing machine, put the washing on, and then ran up to the shower because they were so scared and terrified that they were going to pass anything on to their children in particular.
And some of those individuals, would they perhaps have had people who were shielding in the property?
They may well have done, but I know that many staff made arrangements to live elsewhere or to compartmentalise their homes in those instances.
Moving on to testing, which you deal with starting at paragraph 33 of your statement. You tell us that testing was extended to staff and residents working in care homes, but not staff or service users providing care at home. What impact did that have on your members who were providing care at home services?
So again, it made them feel as though the decision-making was not done on the bounds of risk, but upon where you worked, the location of where you worked. So it reinforced that feeling of being a second-class citizen and reinforced the worry that, you know, they could be passing on the pandemic unknowingly.
Was that issue raised with the Scottish Government?
Yes, it was.
And can you tell us when it was raised and with who?
I couldn't tell you a date at this point in time, but it would have been raised through one of the weekly groups that we attended, most likely CPAG.
And as a result of raising that, was an explanation given for the difference in treatment?
So at one point in time, I was told there was difficulty of access to sufficient number of tests. So decisions had to be made about who got access when.
And did anything change as a result of Scottish Care having raised its concerns with Scottish Government?
So whether it was a result of that or whether it was a result of access to more tests, I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you that. But access was made available to care at home staff eventually. Although again, there was confusion about the type of test, because in some areas there was access to PCRs and in some areas it was LFTs.
At paragraphs 37 to 40, you describe the effect of isolation on persons receiving care at home. Do you know of any evidence, perhaps anecdotally from what you've been told, whether that was affecting the mental health of service users?
Yes. Because if you were shielding in your own home, you're still not connecting with your local community. You know, each of us in this room had, to some extent, an experience of lockdown, but that would have been for a prolonged period. And we know that loneliness has a significant effect on people's mental health. That also had a significant effect on the workers going in to those people's homes because they wanted to be able to spend more time with them because they saw the impact that it was having.
You say they wanted to spend more time, and I think you deal with that in paragraph 40 of your statement. You say that a local authority has the power to increase the length of visits. Were there applications being made to extend the length of visits?
So one of the things which frontline care workers are skilled at doing is completing care notes, and within that they will assess how that individual is at that point in time, and those notes will show changes over time in a person's well-being, behaviour, health, and that would be used as evidence to argue for changes to the package that the provider's commissioned to deliver.
Were there administrative difficulties increasing the hours?
Because there were also staffing shortages within local authorities, because like our members, there were staff absences during the pandemic. There were backlogs in having these assessments seen to, yes.
With the benefit of hindsight, can you offer an opinion on whether there had been a way round that, essentially?
Yes, and in some areas this happened, and particularly where the Self-Directed Support Act is implemented effectively, then there is the ability to change the care and support that's delivered in real time, much more fluidly. So if the Self-Directed Support Act had truly been implemented in Scotland before the pandemic, then there would have been much more flexibility in that in the moment.
And would have that relaxed the assessment criteria, or what would that have done?
It gives tolerances to respond to. So an individual can request changes to their care packages, to increase, to decrease, to do something different with it, to use a different service in their community, not just a care worker. And the same with care workers themselves. You know, they can make the decisions and make changes to that in those times day to day as well, and say, well, actually I can spend a bit longer with you here, but what we'll do is we'll reduce time over here, or instead of, what I'll do is I'll come in and, you know, we can spend time maybe reading or doing something more social, but instead of coming in and cooking you dinner, we could get you a takeaway or something like that. So you can be much more flexible to the needs of the individual in that point in time, upping care at some points, reducing care at other points, just depending what the individual needs there and then. But if you don't have that relationship with your local authority and you don't have a self-directed support really implemented in the correct person-led way, then you're back to real, 15-minute commissioned visits.
And did the local authorities have discretion to do that?
Yes, they do. They do.
And did some local authorities exercise that discretion and others not, or did any of them?
Some, not in response to the pandemic, some did already have those arrangements in place.
Most or few?
A few.
Okay, thank you. At paragraph 45 of your statement, you raise the issue of care staff not being recognised as key workers, and you give the example of the police essentially, I think, stopping them when they're in cars, and Scottish Care having to get involved. Was that due to poorly drafted guidance, or was that due to another reason?
Actually, it's partly about identification. So if you're wearing an NHS uniform, you're visible, and people know and see that you're a key worker. It's, you know, it's clearly understood. But there are such a richness and variety of care providers, and that's a really good thing, because what it does is it offers choice and control to individuals so they can choose who they want to deliver their care and support. But because there's such a variety in that, they were not always visible to the police if they were a care worker, because you know, it could look similar to a hairdresser's uniform or, you know, other service professionals and individuals. So we had to work with providers on, you know, what would be a suitable identification, and to educate the police that that would be the case and that they should be accepting that care workers were key workers.
I want to just ask you a couple of questions about long COVID now, and you talked about a worker coming back and kind of stripping off and jumping into the shower to ensure that no members of the family contracted COVID. As far as you're aware, were your members, if somebody did contract COVID occupationally, was that being recorded in the members' personnel files?
Yes, and they had to report to government and to the local authority on staff who were absent with COVID at any point in time. Some were required to do that daily, some were required to do it weekly, some were required to do it to the local authority and the care inspectorate and the government, some were required just to do it to one of those organisations. So there was a lot of duplication on demand of data provision at that point in time as well.
Can I ask it? I mean, obviously we don't have crystal balls, so if someone catches COVID, we don't know if it's going to develop into long COVID. But if it did develop into long COVID, would that be recognised in the employer's records? You might not know the answer to that, but...
I don't know the answer to that, that's correct.
Okay. Moving on to paragraph 48, you identify that social care workers experienced trauma and that there was inadequate support in place. Can you maybe just tell us what you mean by trauma and what support you expected to be in place or hoped would be in place?
Yeah, so Dr McCaskill spoke eloquently on this for care home workers this morning, and it would be no different for people providing care at home in the community. You build a relationship up with those individuals. You know, it's a job which I used to do many, many years ago, and I couldn't tell you the dates, the times, this, that, and the next thing, but I could tell you, you know, that one of the people I worked with, when they were stressed, the noise of the Hoover calmed them down. I could tell you that another individual liked me to sit beside them and they would hold my hand while we watched old movies. That's the sort of relationships that people had with these individuals, and it wasn't just last week, it's when I was at uni, so I still remember that. I remember how that felt at that point in time. So it's part of your life, a hugely significant part of your life. So when you see the experience that they have when they have COVID, and when there's loss and when people die as a result of COVID, you know, you're losing that relationship too. You are a part, you know, a de facto part of their family. And through that, they experience trauma. You know, they experience significant loss over a prolonged period of time. And we know that some NHS boards were offering psychological support to NHS staff, whereas that wasn't available to the same extent for social care workers. There was well-being support, but not psychological.
And is that, when you say support, is that what you're suggesting should have been available?
Yeah.
Okay. At paragraph 51, you tell us that daycare services were advised not to fully reopen until October 2022. Just a few questions about that. I suppose, firstly, who advised them? Are you aware?
So that would have been guidance that came from the government.
Okay. And do you know, and so if you don't know the answer to, please just tell me, but do you know why they were advised not to fully reopen until October 2022?
I don't know, but assume it would be connected to infection prevention control.
And I may be reading too much into it, but are you criticising, are you being critical of that decision? And if so, why?
So yes, I'm being critical of that decision because this was a significant time after everyone else in the community had gone back to, closer to our normal pre-pandemic behaviour. So people living in their own homes who would have previously had access to the social support that daycare services provided, the stimulation that they had there was not available to them for a very long period of time. And that exacerbated their feelings of loneliness, which had other consequences on their mental health and well-being.
And in your opinion, perhaps with appropriate measures put in place, such as wearing masks, social distancing, whatever that might be, could they have reopened at an earlier stage?
Yes.
And I want to pin you down to a date, but I mean, do you have a view on how much earlier they could have reopened?
I don't. I would need to go back through what was happening at that point in time to do that.
Appreciate that.
And I suppose specifically the science around about what we knew about the virus at that point in time to give that advice.
I suppose just so that we appreciate the impact, how important were those services to the people that used them?
Yeah, so they formed a variety of tasks. It wasn't just a social aspect. They would also provide personal care, provide a warm meal for individuals as well. So if that was something that you were used to accessing day to day and then suddenly didn't get that for, a couple of years really, then it certainly exacerbated feelings of loneliness and put additional pressure on potentially family members who are having to step in to deliver that care and support instead.
I was going to say that, and I appreciate you're not speaking. We'll hear evidence in relation to unpaid carers during the inquiry, but in terms of respite, from your experience, do these types of services offer respite?
Yeah, they did.
Moving on to paragraph 69 and 70, you discuss the issue of data requests, and you indicate that the sector was under pressure from the Scottish Government, local authorities and the Care Inspectorate in relation to data requests. And I suppose I'm just not clear what kind of data was being requested by those bodies.
Yeah. And I think it's important that I say that data collection was an important part of pandemic response. So I'm not saying that it shouldn't have happened. I'm saying that data collection was important, but it was the manner in which it was requested and the duplication was the biggest issue here. So at a time when we really needed our social care workforce supporting individuals, many of them were pulled away to do administrative duties around about data request. So it was more prevalent for care homes than it was for care at home, although in some local authority areas they asked for the same data in care at home as they did for care homes. So the sorts of things that were requested were number of people accessing care and support, number of residents, number of those who had COVID, workforce vacancies, and things like that. But it was the requirement to do that on different forms for each agency that was requesting it, and the requirement to do that on a daily basis in some instances. So at a time when we really need people, concentrating on delivering the care and reducing the risk, they were spent having to fill in forms.
And it is your evidence essentially there could have been a more joined up approach where there was one form filled that could have been sent to all the various agencies, is that essentially?
Yes. And now, one of the things that's happened as a result of the pandemic is it's accelerated the uptake and use of technology and digital. So there are other ways that we can consider going forward to do that on an automated basis that would completely remove the burden altogether if we were coherent in that.
Thank you. So I have some questions, but you seem to have answered them. So, Before I ask if there's anything further you want to add, there's some questions that have been provided to the inquiry by core participants. So I wonder if you can help us with these. So I'll be moving back to the beginning of your statement. At paragraph 4, you say that you sat on the Ministerial Advisory Group for Health and Social Care. Do you know if that involved any planning for a pandemic? Excuse me.
Not at the time when I attended that group, no.
And what time was it that you attended?
So most often it would have been Dr McCaskill and our chair that attended, but I would step in for either of those when one of them couldn't make it, and it was certainly not discussed at any of the meetings that I went to.
And moving forward to paragraphs 49 to 52. At these paragraphs, you discuss the impact on daycare services. Do you know if the issue of closure and reopening of daycare services was discussed at the Scottish Government groups that the Scottish Care attended?
It was, because we raised it, as did some representatives there from unpaid carers organisations.
And what was discussed?
The impact that it was having on the individuals not being able to access it, and also from Scottish Care's perspective, there were significant fiscal implications for those organisations, which might prevent them from being able to open again at all.
And in relation to any potential future pandemic, did the Scottish Government indicate what should happen in relation to daycare services?
No.
Moving forward to paragraphs 73.2 and 74, you mentioned the Clinical Practice Advisory Group for Care Homes, CPAG meetings. Do you know if minutes were taken of those meetings?
Yes, there are, yeah.
And to the best of your knowledge, at any of those meetings, did any attendee call for a human rights impact assessment in relation to restrictions of visits to care homes?
Yes, my colleague Dr McCaskill did.
And what was the, my apologies if this was dealt with this morning, what was the outcome of that?
So the response given at that time was there wasn't capacity to do that.
And finally, at paragraph 80, you discuss Health Protection Scotland guidance. Did Scottish Care provide its members with advice on how guidance would operate in practice?
Actually, it was in many respects the other way around. So what we are very good at is bringing our members together to find a way through this, to navigate the guidance together and to make sense of that. So one of the things that had to be done was to translate the guidance into a way that would be accessible to frontline care workers. So we found that some of our managers were working together to do that. I don't mean Scottish Care's managers, I mean the managers within our membership organisations.
And just in relation to the final question, I appreciate there may be a degree of separation between Scottish Care and the family members, but does Scottish Care provide any advice in relation to family members who are providing care at home?
No.
Simply before I thank you for your time, is there anything that you wish to say that hasn't cropped up in our discussions today, or that is omitted from your statement?
So I guess I want to recognise those that had the privilege to walk alongside during this experience in the pandemic, and thank them for their support in supporting the sector through what has been a very challenging experience. I also know that many of them and many others experienced loss and trauma, so I would wish to express my condolences.
Thank you. I'd just take this opportunity to thank you for your time today, and also the considerable time and effort that you've put into providing an organisational statement with inquiries. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Ms Hedge. We're very grateful.
Thank you, my Lord.
Good.
There are no further witnesses for this
I knew
afternoon.
that. 9:45 on Tuesday morning?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you.